Good morning, everyone, and welcome to ARE Discussions. ARE Discussions is a monthly webinar series on economic issues facing California's agricultural and natural resource communities. My name is Ellen Bruno. I'm an Assistant Cooperative Extension Specialist at UC Berkeley. This seminar is being co-hosted by the four Cooperative Extension economists in the UC system. It's Brittany Goodrich at UC Davis, Mehdi Namadi at UC Riverside, and Tina Saitone also at UC Davis, and myself. A little bit of housekeeping. Only the presenters and hosts are visible and audible. Our meeting will run for 90 minutes. We're going to take ARE discussions to be a little longer than we've been doing previously, so we're not rushed at the end to answer questions. So we'll do guided Q&A with each of our speakers, and then we'll open it up to Q&A with the audience at the end. So please submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll compile those and ask the speakers at the end. And hopefully we'll have time to get to everybody's questions, so don't hesitate to enter a question. Afterwards, our recording of this session will be available on our website, arediscussions.ucdavis.edu. So today we're going to be talking about food fraud and the economic impacts for California agriculture. At the heart of food fraud issues are questions about incentives. So our first speaker is an economist, Dr. Mariah Ehmke, who's an associate professor at the University of Wyoming in the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics. Her research spans a number of issues related to food, health, and the environment, including food fraud. So two agricultural products that are really common targets of food fraud are honey and olive oil. So we also have Chris Hiatt, who is the vice president of the American Honey Producers Association and also the co-owner of Hiatt Honey Co. And then we have Dan Flynn, who's the director of the UC Davis Olive Center. And the Olive Center is sort of a coalition between the university and industry to support research and education related to the olive industry. So thank you all for being here with us today, and I'll pass it over to Brittany.
Thanks, Ellen. Good morning, everyone. I'm excited about this webinar this morning. We've got a lot of good speakers lined up. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump right in with Mariah. So Mariah, can you tell us, just a general overview of food fraud? So what is it? What are the types of foods that are commonly subject to food fraud, and sort of some of the incentives behind it?
I'll be happy to, and I have a few slides to share. Perfect. So let me just bring that over here and start sharing. Okay. And everybody see those okay?
Yep, looks great.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to just give you an overview of food fraud and then focus in a little bit on honey at the end. But I know that we're going to have another speaker on honey, so he can talk more to that specific commodity. So I always want to tell you I sort of hold two things to be true when I work with this. And one is, and I do want to make this point because some of the things I will talk about today may sort of sound scary, but I do honestly believe that I just want to start with this, that the world's food supply is safer now than it has been in almost any point in history. This is just like an example. This is salmonella tests that were run over chicken for school lunches from 2000 to 2014, and you can see that the number of chicken samples in school lunches has gone almost to zero over this time. So I always start with sort of a blanket. I think the food supply chain is safer now than it has been at any point in history, but it's a little bit like hearing about war and terrorism and things like that, in that as we have better information though about our food supply system and we're able to share that information more, we see that at the same time we have there's some of the greatest risks there have been at any point in history. And so I'm going to talk about that and how these have sort of arisen and what's happening in our food chain that not all consumers especially might be aware of. So first, let me start with a definition of food fraud. It has its own special definition that has arisen in the research in this area. And so it occurs when there is an illegal deception in the production and marketing of food for economic gain. So those are some key parts of this that are there in the definition, that the food that the consumer is consuming isn't what they think it is, and that someone is profiting from that deception. And it may or may not be directly related to adulteration, but it often is. And there is also, not always, but often, a link to food safety issues. So food fraud and food safety are not synonymous, but there is a lot of overlap. So food fraud is often then motivated by economic gain, as in the definition, and this can lead to food safety risk. And so especially if food, say it's stolen and isn't kept refrigerated at the right level, or one type of food fraud is to move back the use by date on meats, and so that can create food safety risk. And so, but food safety actually isn't in and of itself a food safety, I'm going to say overlap is not in and of itself a criminal offense. If you accidentally, if there is accidental contamination of E. coli into a vegetable farm from an environmental influence like wild animals, that is not directly and immediately a sign that the farmer has engaged in some sort of intentional illegal activity. Whereas food fraud, there is some intention. Now, what is also interesting that, though, as I've worked with this, is there are a lot of farmers who, as they're farming and they are reading market signals, some of them sort of unknowingly, to a degree, get brought into an illegal activity, and it's the extent that they continue to do that illegal activity as it progresses that they're committing fraud. And just as an example, I'm kind of in collaboration working with the Food Standards Scotland and the Scottish Food Police there, and so I've learned a lot about. I kind of have this niche area of knowledge now in Scottish food fraud. But there was a farmer there who set out to make a farm, so to speak, of sea salt. And as he did this, the market for sea salt increased rapidly, and the demand increased quite a bit. And he actually was not able to meet the demand with he was saying he was selling Hebridean from the Hebridean Islands, Hebridean sea salt, but he wasn't able to meet that demand with his own sea salt. So he started bringing in sea salt from the Mideast and repackaging it as Hebridean sea salt. And essentially, that's when he started down the path towards criminal activity and continued on. So producing sea salt was great. It was wonderful. But when he started to repackage and substitute in products that he didn't list on the label, that's when it ranged into food fraud. So food fraud can have different degrees and different types of risk for the consumer. One is a direct risk. And so this is actually a year ago. One of the most common products that experiences food fraud is seafood. And a year ago, there was an incident actually in my family where I had never, we're from Kansas, and haven't had a lot of experience with seafood, but my brother has moved to a little slice of paradise in Australia, and he's raised my, oh, great. Just a moment. He has raised my nieces to enjoy oysters. And shortly after the fires there, this again, it wasn't exactly an intentional case of food fraud, but if it continued, it would have been. Oyster fishermen, they were trying to do what they could to save their businesses. So an oyster fisherman opened up a stand to sell some fresh oysters seaside, and they did not test the water before they did this. And so my little niece, who is 8 years old, got seafood paralysis from eating the fresh oysters that were caught because the fires there had caused a lot of unexpected pollution into the local rivers, and there was an unexpected algae growth that they hadn't watched out for. And so in this case, if that oysterman had continued to knowingly sell that seafood, he would have been committing fraud. But what it did to my little niece is within hours, she started to lose the feeling in her legs, and she went through about 2 weeks of not being able to walk. She was fortunate in that she recovered, but in worst case scenarios, people actually, it can affect their ability to breathe and they die. So that's one example of like a direct imminent threat of if people are not following the rules and harvest seafood without testing the water, doing things like that, they can kill people. Then there's some indirect effects. And so these are due to longer term exposure. And one of the issues we've had in, say, the honey industry, and I'm sure you'll hear a little bit more about this, has been the illegal importation of honey from places like China, where there's a lot of environmental pollutants. And so bees are great magnets for sponges for chemicals and elements in the environment. And in areas where there's heavy pollution, heavy levels of lead and mercury, gradually they could bring, if you continue to eat honey sourced from those areas and those bees, you could start to see those sorts of contaminants in your own body. And then there's technical sort of food fraud and food and related risks. These tend to be less dire to public health and are more a matter of impacting, say, consumer welfare and value for money. And so an example, again, from my work in Scotland is they've had to do, they're doing a lot of work to protect and document the origin of their beef, because people could easily just slap a Scottish beef label on any beef and say it is Scottish beef. But people who want Scottish beef are paying for that Highland imagery and thought that they're getting sort of from a pure grass-fed source. This won't kill you if you eat Scottish beef, that is a beef that is fraudulently labeled Scottish, but it's stealing that value added from the producers in that area, as well as decreasing when and if the consumers do discover they're not eating what they thought they were eating, decreasing their welfare. And I will just say one of the biggest food fraud incidences we've had that sort of really launched academic research into this, it was in the UK when horse meat was substituted in for beef. Horses were illegally stolen in Eastern Europe, brought into the UK, and then ground into beef, and consumers were unknowingly eating it. Didn't kill them, but it was certainly a sort of a more of a cultural taboo in the UK than in Eastern Europe to be eating horse beef. And as you can, I mean, same here in America, we wouldn't want to suddenly expect we were eating horse meat when we thought we were having a hamburger. So some of the main types of food fraud include, so ones you may be most familiar with are adulteration, actually taking a product and changing it in a way, or tampering, maybe opening the packaging and repackaging it, or taking off important packaging that shows what the use by date is, or the different safety inspections. I have these color coded in that I think these are probably like in this highest risk to public health sort of area, or the red ones. And then there's these areas, actually simulation can also be very, very deadly in terms of it is a making of a product that you think it is a product, but it's really another product. And some of the worst case scenarios I can think about this are when this actually happened a lot recently in the pandemic. There's been a lot of simulation of rice, where when there's been due to the pandemic, there was a shortage of rice, say going into Nigeria. And so people started trying to sell little plastic pellets that looked like rice. And so that is making a product that isn't the product, but looks like the product. And obviously we wouldn't want to be eating plastic rice. Similar things have been done in Vietnam and China with eggs, making a plastic artificial product that actually looks and feels like an egg. And then there's counterfeit. And so this is usually you find this in higher end products like French wines, where they are being sold. It's just an ordinary wine, but somebody has made a French label and put it on there. So it's kind of like selling an ordinary handbag as a Louis Vuitton handbag, but it's food. And then there is diversion, where food was intended for one market but is switched over to another. We see a tiering of food that is produced for, say, rural versus urban areas of China. And sometimes this can happen where food that was intended for one market and may actually truly be subpar is then diverted and sold into another market for more. There's overrun. This happens a lot with foreign direct investment type situations where a company has been licensed to produce food in another country, and then that licensed manufacturer produces more than they're contracted to do, and then profits from that privately. And then there's all-out theft, and we see this a lot with entrance of organized crime organizations into the food chain, where they are taking the food and selling it separately. And so there's some crazy crimes out there, like organized crime gangs have stolen Nutella trucks and then resold the Nutella and profited from it. And food fraud is not a small issue. These are figures from the United Nations in 2017, but it gives a picture of what is the global cost of food fraud and how it compares to other types of organized crime and illegal activity. So this is in millions of dollars. In 2017, the illegal trade in food fraud was actually, so this is over $40 trillion. And then we have, it is actually, there's a higher value in food fraud or food being traded fraudulently than there is in illegal drugs or identity theft, or even the international small arms illegal trade. And one of the things, though, is that this has been trending upwards over the last 10 years, because compared to these sort of highly offensive and very criminal activities, food isn't, there's not drugs, food sniffer dogs. There are in some ways, but not in the same way as there are drug sniffer dogs. You can cross a border with a truck of Nutella and it's not illegal in the same way it is with illegal drugs. So organized crime networks have been turning to food more and more as a way to finance their activities. One thing that we're still sort of like holding our breath and waiting to understand is how this is transpiring during COVID. I highly suspect that it is making it worse because we've had a lot of food shortages and breakdowns in the supply chain. And so there's a lot of opportunities, as we've seen actually, like with rice in developing countries, of trying to trade illegal goods. And especially as we've had some of the borders as well, some embargoes and things like that were kind of unusual placed. I think there's probably more of this we'll see at the end of this tunnel that we're in than we saw going into it. So you may be asking at this point in the conversation, are you at risk of food fraud? And basically I have to say, have you eaten today? So yes, you are. There's more. This is where the presentation gets really scary, as far as some of the biggest offenders of food fraud are things like fruit juice, especially fruit juices, where there's anytime there's sort of an extra value added claim like it includes more antioxidants. There is some very specialized high-end fruit drinks and juices that come from fine berries found in Finland, but really can't differentiate. The average consumer can't differentiate those berries from an ordinary cranberry. So where things can be added, sweetened, kind of messed with a little bit, there's a higher chance. Tea. I'm actually an avid tea drinker, but I now, after studying food fraud, I only source my tea from certain places. And because again, especially if you buy the tea in the bag, it gets chopped up. It could be bark, it could be a number of different types of things. So I advise loose leaf tea. Instant coffee, again, it's a powder. It could be a number of different things. Bottled water and milk. There's a lot of claims about bottled water and its purity, but as we can all guess, it could be out of any faucet. Milk is been a big source. At the beginning of my slide, I had a picture of milk splashing, and really where my study into food fraud started was when I was in sabbatical in New Zealand. It was shortly following the 2013 melamine milk crisis, where melamine, or a plastic powder, was put into baby formula in China to try to make that formula look like it had higher protein quantity. And unfortunately, some of that fraud happened at some New Zealand plants there. And what struck me was that because New Zealand is a small country with a major dependence on their dairy industry, this actually caused a countrywide recession later there. So food fraud also, not only is it big business or becoming something big for mafiosos and whatnot, it actually has big economic consequences for society. Historically, one of the sort of most ancient areas we go back to is any kind of wine, alcohol, spirits. It's really easy for those things to either be watered down, have colors added, those sorts of things, adulterated in some way. Coconut water in I think it was 2017. The UK had every now and then they just randomly select and audit a certain commodity being imported, and they chose coconut water. And they found that, I believe it was nearly 2/3 of the coconut water wasn't really pure coconut water. And again, it's just a sort of milky white substance. It's hard to tell. Ground meat, eggs, salt. And I'm going to, of course, focus today on honey. Another big one, though, at the bottom of this list is spices. Those are, again, it's kind of like tea, little fine things. It's really hard to tell unless you're an expert sometimes whether or not different little bits of other types of leaves, say, are being added to your mint and those sorts of things. So these are some of the most common offenders. The other one I do not have actually here, but should really be the banner over everything in some ways, is seafood. There's a number of different ways that seafood can be misrepresented, or other products can be sold as seafood. One of the newest ones I've heard of lately is pork rectums being sold as calamari. So another fun thing to think about, and maybe you can be glad can't go to some restaurants right now if you think about that. So there's a whole world I call the dark honey world, and we may be familiar with money laundering. There's also honey laundering that goes off. So I'm not going to cover this too much because I know we have another speaker in the queue that will talk a lot about California honey. But California produces a lot of honey. You guys are in there right with the rest of the nation, and very close to the national average in terms of price received, and pretty productive hives. The honey market is increasingly important to look at in terms of food fraud, because as you can see in this graph, what has happened is this redder line going up is our imports of honey, and we now more than 2/3 of the honey that we consume in America is imported from the rest of the world. And we have pretty flat export production. So what happens in the rest of the world in the international honey market is very important to our consumers. A lot of our imported honey is being consumed as an additive to other processed foods. And so that's another area that makes, kind of when we talk about incentives, food fraud a little bit more likely, is if you can't tell or if it is an ingredient into something else. So that's why one reason I think we see a proliferation in honey. Early on, one of the countries that we've had sort of the most complicated relationship with in this area is China, and they're this light blue line that I have from 2000s to here to 2019. What our trade has looked at like with China, and you'll see that from 2000 until about 2007, we are actively importing honey from China. But at this point, this is when it was really brought to attention of lawmakers that there was a high level of toxins in China's honey, especially sulfa, and high enough loads that if you have a sulfa allergy like myself, you could actually have a reaction. And so we decreased our imports of honey from China, and it has then been replaced by, we have a lot more honey coming in from India and Vietnam over time. However, after we've renegotiated our trade agreement with China, we see a resurgence of Chinese honey. So these are a few reasons you might care as a consumer, if not a producer, about fraudulent honey. And honey coming, say, from Chinese hives, is they have had looser regulations on the type of pesticides and antibiotics that can be applied to their hives, and that goes directly into the honey. Many of the chemicals that they apply, this broad spectrum of chemicals, only 10 are actually approved for application in the US. And as I mentioned before, then one of the key chemicals or key medicines they put on has a high level of sulfate, which can have real adverse reactions for some consumers. And there's this increase in mercury and heavy metals from the environment. One of the biggest sort of stings, if you will, in the food fraud world was in 2011, when a German sweetener firm called ALW was actually caught. So what they did is they had a number of here, this is China highlighted in the middle, but they had a number of buyers basically sending honey into a central location and then re-exporting it through many of these countries. And they would actually go and pasteurize the honey, so you could not pick up the pollen and different indicators of the source and origin, and then it was exported into the United States. We in 2011 found that some of this was caught when some some honey marked as coming from Korea was really Chinese. And this led to a number of indictments and prosecutions, and then essentially closing down of much of this import business into the United States. So I think some emerging issues in thinking about how food fraud kind of works and what it is that we need to be thinking about is how COVID-19 and this broad disruption of U.S. supply chains that we have witnessed is going to probably promote more food fraud until we have this sort of supply chain back to an equilibrium. I think it's still out of equilibrium as we see restaurants closing and different alignments needing to be made. we also see higher risk of food fraud in markets with higher premiums. And so one of the honeys that I've been most interested in is Manuka honey. It's a very high value honey exported from New Zealand for not just consumption like with food, but also for medical uses. And so it's been a big target of fraud. And then also, as we have like environmental sort of catastrophes like hive collapses and drought, and we have a shortage of honey in the United States, then we can expect higher risk of food fraud in that supply chain. I am also this research bleeds in that I'm working on bleeds into understanding. Then there's a lot of promotion of how blockchain may be able to help verify source better, help understand where food, say, gets diverted or theft has occurred. It's also, though, unfortunately, cryptocurrencies are also being used as a way to finance these activities. So I think that there's a role here for understanding and trying to uncover the role of the dark web and misinformation in this market, in markets as well, to help understand food fraud. One of the challenges we face, especially in the United States, I feel like the EU has done, and now UK as it separates off, have done a little bit better, is having a single agency focused on this issue. One of our main challenges in the United States is to actually identify and bring a case of food fraud to like prosecution. We have to have the kind of coordination of FDA, USDA, and the Justice Department. When this is just sort of a policy thing I would love to see in the future is just more of a dedicated agency and area of specialization to this within our government. And then we also have more complicated links between county, state, national, and international. Like as I'm working with the Scottish Food Police, I happen to know they are collaborating with the state of California, but I'm not sure how that links with our national institutions and these different dimensions we need, like working across FDA, USDA, and Justice Department. We also need to be able to identify what the market incentives and market failures are with this. I'm working with graduate students on this in terms of looking at economic models and economic simulations. And one of the things we're also doing is analyzing. There are emerging technologies. Food scientists and food chemists are working on different tests and methods to identify food fraud. And I think from a public resource perspective, one of the things the governments need more information than on, and different commodity groups, is which one of these technologies works best, is most efficient, and most worth our investment to pursue. So those are my main points. It's sort of the background on food fraud, which I hope helps provide context for our broader discussion today.
Awesome. Thanks, Mariah. That was really in-depth and really helpful for us to get a big picture idea about things. So now I think we're going to transition over to asking Chris Hiatt some questions. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty about the honey market. And so the first thing that I would like, Chris, for you to sort of cover is just a general overview of the honey market, how U.S. honey production works. What I was looking at the slides that Mariah showed, and she showed the honey price of $2 a pound. And if any honey consumers were looking, they're probably thinking, I don't pay $2 a pound for my honey. So can you tell us a little bit more about the differences in bulk honey and how all of that works?
Sure, Brittany. Yeah, I'm not getting paid $2. I wish I was getting paid $2 for my honey. Yeah, I'm Chris Hiatt, American Honey Producers. Brittany asked me to, just because a lot of people do not have any idea how honey is made. So just really quick, I will do a quick run through of how honey is made. Oh, real quick, me and all my brothers, I have 5 brothers. My mom and dad started this business 54 years ago. So I live in Fresno, California, 8 months of the year, North Dakota, 4 months of the year. And we ship bees between California to Washington for apple pollination, to North Dakota to make honey, and come back to spend the winter in a less than cold winter environment like North Dakota, and we pollinate almonds. And in fact, about 2 weeks from now, I'll start moving bees into almonds. They'll start blooming in about 3 weeks. So when you go pull honey, you have bee yards all spread out throughout the prairie and pastures, and you try to be near alfalfa fields or canola or natural grass areas where there's clover and stuff. So you take your trucks and boxes, and you put, when you get there, you have to get the bees out of the boxes, right? Because you don't want to take all the bees into your warehouse and you lose your workforce. So you can see this picture, we put a funnel board which has burlap on it. You point it into the wind, we sprinkle a little chemical onto the burlap, and that fume drives the bees down. And by hand, you pull the boxes and put them onto a pallet, and we have a forklift.
It looks like we may have lost Chris. Maybe he'll come back.
Let me
Because I think he's still on.
see. It appears like it. I might stop his sharing to see if it jars anything loose. Oh, no, now he's gone. And maybe it makes sense, Dan, if you were maybe ready, maybe we could flip the order a little bit.
That's fine.
And maybe that'll give Chris an opportunity to kind of come back on, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Thanks, Dan, for being flexible and
No
also
problem.
for joining us today.
I've had my share of these
So
connection
first
problems.
off, sure. Haven't we all in this day and age, right? Would you be willing to give us an overview of the market for olive oil generally? So maybe as an example, how is the majority of production cultivated in the US, and how is the product typically marketed?
Sure. Well, so in the US, we consume about 90 million gallons of olive oil per year, which breaks down to about 1 quart per person per year. Now, some of you out there may consume more than that, but that's just averaged over the entire country. And most of that is sold at retail, but a good percentage of it is sold through food service, restaurants, institutional uses. And that would be different grades of olive oil. And in basic terms, there's the olive oil that's produced in a sort of a natural, minimally processed way, which we generally see sold as extra virgin. And then there's oils that are refined, similar to oils that we typically consume for corn and soy and vegetable oils. That goes through a different process that's quite a bit more industrial. And so of those 90 million gallons that we consume in the US, California only produces about 3 to 4% of that. It's a relatively modest sized industry here in California, which means that most of the oil that we consume in the US is imported. And it's mostly imported from the Mediterranean countries, but it also can be coming from South America or Australia or any other place that produces olive oil that could be able to sell it on the bulk market and import it into the US. We have in California maybe 37,000 acres dedicated to olive oil production. Now let's contrast that to all that imported oil that's coming in. It suggests that there's quite a bit more oil that's produced outside of California. The Mediterranean is the biggest producer in the world, and the largest producer in the Mediterranean is Spain. So I just said that we have 37,000 acres of olive oil production in California. In Spain, they have 6 million acres. So it's just in a magnitude of difference that we have in our size compared to outside of California with some of the bigger producers. Now, compared to the rest of the world, much of the production in California is done in very modern, high-density orchards that look a bit like vineyards. The trees are planted about 5 feet apart. They are kept in a very tight hedge, and then the harvester will run over the hedge and harvest the olives mechanically. And it's a very efficient way to get the fruit off the tree and over to the processing facility. That is not how it's done in most of the rest of the world. Most of the rest of the world, the olives are either hand-picked or the olives are shaken off the tree. And so it's a much slower process to get the fruit from the orchard into the processing facility. So that's kind of an overview of how olive oil is, what the market is looking like and the types of olive oil that we have.
Thank you very much for that. So now kind of into our topic of fraud specifically, what type of fraud has been occurring in olive oil, and what are kind of the differences across the different types of quality of olive oil and other product attributes that are relevant to the consumer and to marketing?
So let's talk first about how this extra virgin olive oil is produced, since most people are familiar with that, but they may not really understand how that product is made and what makes it different from all the other oils that we have available to us to use in the kitchen. So I said that, you know, much of what we consume in the US is extra virgin. What the process is essentially it's minimally processed fruit juice, because olives are a fruit. They're taken from the field, they're crushed, the juice is extracted, and the oily part of the juice is what goes into the package. And so it's a fairly natural and minimal process. And in contrast, the refined oils that we also can buy at the store, and olive oil can also be refined, go through a different process in which the oil is extracted using either solvents or high heat and steam. There's a refined, bleached, and deodorized process that is discussed for this type of product. And the end result of that is a fairly neutral tasting oil that would not have a flavor impact in the kitchen with what you're preparing it with. So with extra virgin, what you're looking for and what consumers value in it are flavor, because it's just basically fruit juice, and also the healthful qualities of it. Because it's a minimal process, a lot of the healthful antioxidants and other compounds that are in the fruit make their way into the oil. And that's what the consumer values with olive oil. So when it comes to the fraud that we've seen in olive oil, there's two types. One is related to the quality and what we could call quality fraud. And that's where an oil that is sold as extra virgin may not meet the standards for extra virgin. And the standards are quantified through chemical tests, but they're also quantified through a sensory test with a trained panel of tasters. And the quality issues that you would have with extra virgin would be if the oil was old and it started tasting rancid, which all oils will at sooner or later. Just the process of oxidation is going to make them rancid. Or there could have been problems with the fruit, like when the fruit was harvested. If it sat at the processing facility in a pile for a long time, the fruit would start to rot or ferment, and the flavor, the sort of off flavors that you would get from that would make their way into the oil. And so the standard for extra virgin is you cannot sell anything that has a defective flavor, such as rancidity or some type of fermentation defect. You can't sell that as extra virgin. And so the quality fraud would be if you're selling that defective flavored oil as extra virgin. All right, so that's one type of fraud. The second type of fraud is adulteration, which was discussed by Mariah. And so adulteration is when you're putting some other type of oil into a package that says olive oil, Or if it says extra virgin olive oil, maybe you're putting refined olive oil in there. That would also be considered adulteration, because refined olive oil doesn't have the same value. It doesn't have the flavor or healthful qualities as extra virgin olive oil. And so when we did some studies on this, and our studies were over 10 years ago, so you need to keep this in mind that we haven't done recent studies. This was information from 10 years ago. But what we found back then, when we pulled olive oil off the shelf, is about 2/3 of the imported oils that we tested did not meet the extra virgin standards. And it was primarily this quality fraud that I discussed, where the oil was older, rancid, might have had some fermentative off flavors. And we found that, in 2/3 of the oil we tested, that was the case. We found a lesser percentage of that with the California oil, but it's still it's a challenge for every olive oil producer to try to preserve the quality of this minimally processed fruit juice. And so those were the results we had. But as I say, we haven't done new studies in 10 years. And I don't know what the situation would be if we did a similar test today.
Great. Thank you so much for that incredibly comprehensive overview. We really appreciate it. We're going to invite Dan back to hopefully intersperse some questions with Chris in just a little bit. I think that Chris has joined us again. Is that correct, Brittany?
Yeah, he is back. So hopefully we can try this again. So Chris was in the middle of telling us about honey production. So Chris, if you want to try and share your screen again.
Yeah, sorry about that. There's just too many kids on Zoom. One college kid and two.
We all know about that.
And me. Okay, so I will. Okay, there we go. So I was talking about how good clover honey was. So, and then, and that's what you don't want to see, a drought year in North Dakota where there's nothing for the bees to do, right? So then we bring the honey back into the warehouse, put into a hot room, which keeps it about 90 degrees. There's floor heat there. So it'll spin out easier, because you don't want, in a cold situation, the honey will not spin out. We load our extractors, which they have an uncapper machine. You send the frames through, it caps off that top layer of wax. It goes into the conveyor belt, hand loaded into machines, about 100 frames per machine. And then the honey goes into the sump where wax rises to the top and the honey stays in the bottom. And we pump that into a storage tank. And then there's some of my kids and nieces unloading. So it's a family affair. So they had to show them. And then you barrel it there from your honey tanks. And then we have a honey separation. We have wax. They separate the honey and the wax from the capping, so that you don't waste anything, because wax is valuable. There's another look. And when you're done, you take the boxes and put them in the warehouse, and you just leave them till next year. So beekeeping is a lot of capital that you'll use, part of the year just sitting there. But that's just a quick run through of how honey is extracted and processed. So this is a good slide. I mean, you can just look at the production from the 90s, 230 million pounds, and look at, I don't even have the last few years. It's about the same, 150 million pounds. And that really just shows you what's happened in the Midwest. About 80% of the nation's hives go to the upper Midwest, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Minnesota, for the summer to make honey, but a lot of it is corn and soy now. So there's a lot less pastures, hay ground, CRP program, it's gone away, and it's a little bit depressing. This just shows you, which Mariah's already shown us, just the amount of import honey and the amount of domestic honey going down over the years. Again, I mean, we used to be, 1986, 62% of all honey was domestic honey. And we're probably less than quarter now, I would imagine. One little thing I'd mentioned, just a few years ago, the NAS survey, pollination passed honey for beekeeper income for the very first time ever. So that just shows you kind of what to stay in business. And luckily almonds are such an important crop and demand such a high price to have them pollinated. It's one reason why we're still in business. This is a good slide. I mean, you can just see the, you've already seen Vietnam and India, the amount of imports coming from those countries. And look at the number of beehives that have increased. So some of that honey, is from China. They've transshipped it through these other countries. A few years ago, we paid our association, we paid the Georgetown Economics Department to do a study. It was like a $120,000 study, and they showed little countries like Myanmar, Taiwan. Over the last few years, they've increased 500–600% in their honey production, when the rest of the world is having bees die and all of this. Well, I mean, it's because of transshipment of Chinese honey. And also there's people in the Far East that are blatantly selling on Alibaba, which is Amazon's version in China, syrups that'll say they can pass this test, they can pass NMR, they can pass this. So they're blending it with honey. I mean, that's one of our huge problems. One thing that has helped in the past, we had in 2001, was the dumping order. And that really helped, shut the door to China selling at 30–40 cents a pound on, dumping onto our market. So this dumping order helped raise the price by almost $1 a pound. I went back and looked at our records. We were getting like 56 cents in 2001, and in 2002 went up to like $1.40, $1.50, which is pretty amazing because that's we're just barely above that now, all these years later. So we do a lot of work in DC. That's our brain trust in DC meeting with, Vice Senator Hoeven or USDA and things. One thing that we wish we could do was we have to have industry support, and there's a lot of packers that pretty much don't want to change it, is change the labeling laws. USDA grade A doesn't really mean much. You go to Walmart or whatever, you look on the back, it'll say product of India, Vietnam, Argentina, USA. And we really would like to do what the Canadians do. So you can see that this is a mix of honey that is or could be from the European Union. I mean, that's pretty blank, but the Canadians now, if it's Canada #1, as you can see, if you zoom in, that is only 100% Canadian honey. So if they have Canada #1, it has to be 100% Canadian. If it's a blend, it'll have, what does it say down below? Grade #1. We really would want to do something similar. We're not having very much support from industry because there's a consumer should know. Instead of a tiny little inkjet printed country of origin somewhere on the bottom or the top of the bottle, right on the front of the label, USA honey 100%, or Canadian honey 100%. That's something else we're working on that we think we could help. And then this is probably what the newest things that have happened is that a lot of people are pulling honey off the shelf, this big English supermarket, because they found, syrups and other things in their honey. Vice did a really good article. This girl, Shayla, interviewed me, and she went out on her own and tested honey. She found some stuff at Trader Joe's that wasn't 100% honey. She went and got all these multiple tests and did kind of this whole sting operation. Same thing in India, in the Philippines, and England recently. There's been a really good one out of India. This news group went and tested a whole bunch of honey and put the results and put the brand names out there. And so I think that's one way you could clean up the market, is just kind of peer pressure. And then this was kind of interesting too, Appomondia, which is the biggest world bee convention last year. 46% of the honey samples were removed from the show because for the very first time, they used nuclear magnetic resonance testing on the honey. So, what did they find? Chlorophenicol, added sugars, diastase, tylosin, which is an antibiotic. I mean, so the market does need to be cleaned up. We don't want to hurt the image of honey, but we do want to have legitimate honey sold on the shelf so the beekeepers can compete and that we can stay in business. There's an NMR machine at the University of Missouri. They're probably one of the top NMR labs in the country. One one thing, I'll stop screen sharing. One thing I wanted to mention was, I mean, during this whole pandemic, the price of, I don't know how to end it. There we go. The price of honey has increased, and just 10 years ago, the retail price was $4. Now it's close to $8. So you'd think that our price would have increased, but it's not. I mean, and Mariah touched on that. A lot of it is the economically motivated adulteration. So some of the things we've done, we formed a task force with the other bee group in the United States and all the packers and the big players, Sue Bee, the co-op, and we are trying to work on cleaning up the market. And we've had mixed results there. There's also self-certifications like True Source is one, but it's all voluntary. And no, it wasn't up until this year they are finally going to test. And I think a lot of that was just peer pressure from bee groups like the American Honey Producer saying, yeah, there needs to be some testing because there's all this volume of honey coming in. The prices they're coming in at is fairly dubious. There's other certifications that just started. There's one called Genu Honey, where there is actual testing involved. And with the latest testing, which is nuclear magnetic resonance, high resolution mass spec, and other tests. There is kind of like a typical problem between a packer producer issue, just like beef industry and others. The producers feel like we're not being treated fair and not being paid for our crop accordingly.
Hey,
And
Chris,
yes,
I just wanted to jump in and see if you could maybe give a little bit more explanation. And maybe you said this already, but just in case anybody else missed it, who's not familiar with the honey industry. But okay, can you tell us so how do you sell your honey? Do you sell all of your honey at the farmer's market? I assume probably not. And so tell us the difference between farmer's market honey and stuff in the grocery store. Can you maybe do that as a little back?
Yeah, commercial beekeepers produce so much honey that you couldn't sell it all in my area at a local market, right? Which is a lot of beekeepers are trying to do that. And that market is becoming crowded too, but at least they are getting a better price. You're packing your own honey and going to a market or going to local grocery stores. But when you produce millions of pounds of honey, you have to have somewhere to go with it. So all of our honey goes to a big packer and some other small ones across the United States. And a lot of it is sent to like Costco under the Kirkland brand, but it's blended our honey with Argentina or other places. So that's kind of when I was talking about packers, that's what I meant.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and move on and maybe do some back and forth between you and Dan. So, because I don't think Tina is here right now. So let's go ahead and start with Dan in the olive oil scenario. So what has actually been done to reduce or eliminate food fraud with olive oil, and what were the challenges associated with it?
After we had done our studies about 10 years ago, it spurred a number of actions and quite a bit of media attention globally about this issue. So one of the things, though, that it's important to point out is that there is no real federal enforcement of standards for olive oil in the United States. We don't have a mandatory standard nationally for olive oil. And so as a result of that, there's been other means of trying to conduct enforcement. Some of that has occurred through actions by private parties in the courts. And those have had varying levels of merit. Some of them have been successful, if not here in the US, then in courts outside the US. To some extent, industry groups will be policing this issue. And so if you're a member of a trade association, they will do some testing and they will take some kind of disciplinary action if they see that one of their members or maybe another company that's outside their association is not playing with honest products out on the marketplace and accurately grading their product. And then a third way of dealing with enforcement is just with the companies are out there testing the products on the marketplace and testing their own competitors. So all of these are happening outside of governmental regulation. I think the challenge is really for the government is that there's, like I said before, there's chemistry tests to evaluate the quality of olive oil. There's also a sensory test where you have a trained panel of at least 8 tasters who are trained to recognize defects in olive oil, and the analysis that they do is empirically tested, and they must meet certain levels of proficiency. But what the government would really be more comfortable with, rather than this sensory test, is some kind of chemical test that could give you a yes or no as to whether an olive oil is legit. And that is technically a very difficult issue to address, but there's quite a bit of work going on here in California and globally to try to reach that point. And it may not be where every single olive oil could be tested this way. It could be that it's good for screening out the clearly good oils and the clearly fraudulent oils. But for those oils that are right on the edge of, on this quality fraud, if they're not quite rancid yet, but they're getting old and they're getting close to tasting rancid, then maybe those would be the ones you segregate and use a sensory panel to test, because the sensory assessment is very sensitive. It's just that it's hard to create something like that very broadly across the industry because it's expensive.
Just to clarify, when you say sensory assessment, you mean that people are testing the olive oil to make sure it's...
They're actually tasting it, and they have been trained to recognize rancidity and fermentative defects and other defects that our senses are quite sensitive in perceiving. But it's also a source of controversy in the industry, because you can send, particularly for an oil that's right on the edge of whether it's rancid or not, you could send that oil to one panel and they'll say it's extra virgin. You could send it to another panel and they'll say, we think enough of our panelists have tasted rancidity for us to not classify this as extra virgin.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna say that sounds very subjective. So thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah.
Okay, so Chris, I'm gonna go ahead and have you answer the same question, but in terms of honey. So what has been done to reduce or eliminate honey fraud, and what are the challenges associated with these attempts?
Yeah, one of the big things that occurred this past year was our association. We got $1.5 million from Congress appropriated for Customs to update their testing capability, which they were using 17-year-old like trace element testing. So now they have NMR and they're using other testing. So that was Senator Hoven and some other really good lobbying efforts on our part. So we're happy about that. That should be up and running almost now. But really, it's really a national food security issue. National food security issue, because if you don't have beekeepers that are profitable, what are you going to pollinate your food with? Every third bite of food you eat is a result of a honeybee. Almonds, strawberries, blueberries, apples, all the seed crops, carrots, onions. So we're a little bit more than a commodity. We're really, the food supply is, do we want to import more of our food? So that's one reason that we tell people on Capitol Hill, for us to get a fair price for honey is paramount. We really want to stay in business. And when we're getting $1.50, $1.60 a pound, which is the price from 10, 15 years ago, and everything else has gone up with the massive bee losses, we're losing 30, 40% of our hives every year. yeah, we really want, and that's why we're pushing so hard to get a fair price of honey. But yeah, we don't have a standard of an identity. We tried, but they told us the olive oil industry kind of ruined it for everybody because they just don't go into that business anymore. So USDA directed us to use the commercial item description, and that got in place last year after years and years of work. It's the next best thing. So there is some standard about raw versus, pasteurized honey, how long and how hot you can heat the honey so it can be classified as raw or is it processed. And there's other things in that standard. But yeah, we never did get a standard of identity.
What about, so you mentioned the testing. How accurate is the current testing for honey fraud? Because from my understanding, there's a lot of, yeah, it's not very useful. So can you talk about that and maybe the progression of the different testing technologies, if you know any?
Yeah, I mean, the C3, C4 sugar test has been used for years and you can detect things, but there's still, even with nuclear magnetic resonance, you can still have to, I've been told 5-10% syrup in that honey and still pass. So that's why you have to do 2 or 3 tests to make sure that it is legitimate honey. And that's the high resolution mass spec, NMR, and still do the C3, C4, because we know there are fraudsters that are still, after they ultra filter honey, which by definition is not honey anymore. They're using resin technology and water to scrub that honey. That is not honey anymore by definition. And after they do that, they're throwing, getting a bag of pollen and throwing pollen in it to make it look like it's honey. And that has been detected more and more. And that is our big push to clean up the market, because we do know there's adulterated or economically, economically motivated adulteration happening in the honey world. So that will hopefully raise our price.
Got it. And is there any sort of, so Dan was talking about the sensory, so basically just tasting the honey. Is there any way to taste honey and tell that it's adulterated? Or
some of the honey you can, and if it's so runny, because the Chinese are famous for extracting honey when it's immature honey, it's still nectar, and the high moisture content is just through the roof, and then that honey can ferment, or that nectar can ferment. So that, and that's not honey either by definition. So yeah, no, but you have to do the testing. You can taste and smell, but you do need to do the testing. It's not quite like all of them. I mean, there obviously are, like I've been told, and I know for a fact that India has a lot of their honey is very smelly and it's very dark. And when I get those barrels that have been cleaned out and they still have maybe a little residue in it to refill that have come from it, you can smell it. And the last few years, I really haven't smelled that, even though it's from India. So, I'm just wondering, how did this Indian honey that used to be so dark and smelly become so white and non-smelly? So it's probably because it was ultra filtered or resin tech scrubbed honey. So
interesting. Okay, let's go back to Dan now. So could you talk about whether there are any sort of I think you maybe touched on the public programs, but are there any like current verification programs for olive oil that are in place that consumers can know this is actually the olive oil that I want to be buying?
Yes, actually in California, there's been an effort for several years to engage the state government as well as the industry in policing the quality of California produced olive oil. Now, this doesn't cover the imported oil, which is most of what we are consuming in the US, but it's done a very good job in evaluating the quality and providing consumer assurances for California produced olive oil. So this is done through an organization called the California Olive Oil Commission. There are other state commissions like this in California that are basically driven by the producers and the growers in that industry to regulate themselves, to make sure that they're playing on an even field with their competitors, at least their domestic competitors. And what California did through the Olive Oil Commission is establish much tougher standards than are available at the international level. And in fact, they are pointing out that their standard is the toughest mandatory standard in the world. There is mandatory testing for the oils produced in California that that meet the minimum requirements for regulation in California, meaning that there's at least, let's see, 5,000 gallons is the minimum amount that is subjected to these regulations, which translates into, say, about 30 acres. If you're producing oil on 30 acres, you're subjected to California's restrictions. And so every year there's mandatory testing to make sure that the oil meets the grades that it's being sold at. And then there are also traceability requirements that are required by the Olive Oil Commission. And that allows the commission to trace back where that oil came from, particularly if they see some kind of quality problem with the oil. So this set of requirements that are applied to California oil has helped to gradually improve the quality of California oil as the producers become more aware of what they need to do to meet the standards, these strict standards that we have in California. And there's other things that are happening in this industry to promote California. There's companies that are promoting California. There are education efforts going on with retailers, et cetera. But one of the results that has coincided with the adoption of standards in California through the Olive Oil Commission is that there's a 50% price premium that California oil enjoys over the imported price. And then there's also in addition to this state regulation that was established through the industry, there's also a longstanding trade group called the California Olive Oil Council that has had tougher standards than the international standard. And they have a seal that will verify that the oil has been tested and it meets the standards of the California Olive Oil Council. So those are some of the things that have done to provide some verification. As far as the imported oil goes, there's an organization called the North American Olive Oil Association. I'm not as familiar with their testing requirements, but I do know that they test the oils of their membership based on the international standard. And they have taken actions in the past on members that have not abided by those standards or whose oils are being sold in the marketplace and are not meeting the standards. But like I said before, we haven't done a comprehensive shelf survey for 10 years that would encompass imported oil. So we don't know what the level of adherence to the standard is. But I think there's some discussions going on between domestic and importers about, updating that study at some point in the future.
Okay, I was just going to ask you that if there were plans to update it. So thank you for talking about that. Okay, Chris, let's talk about on the honey side. I know you mentioned the True Source honey label. What sort of verification programs are in place for honey to verify that you're getting, U.S. honey, if that's what you want, or maybe some other type of honey?
Yeah, like I'd mentioned, True Source, we're a member of True Source, and it's just a volunteer, certification. And all these years, it's just, they would do paperwork to verify where in India, where in Vietnam did this honey come from, where in Argentina, Brazil. And if it was a legit, exporter, did it come from a beekeeper and stuff like that. There had been issues of, ICE did a couple busts and some of it was True Source honey, but it's great that they are going to start testing with True Source honey. And there's another one, like I mentioned, Genu honey, which has already been doing the testing. I would just suggest everyone just buy USA honey, make sure that it's on the label, because when you get blended honey, you have a chance of having syrup in it, or it's been ultra filtered, or it's got chlorophenicol from China or something like that. Plus you're supporting American beekeepers. There was a question that someone had asked about NMR that the Germans really came up with, and for years, NMR, they have a big database, and NMR, a lot of the samples of our honey and other honey have been sent to Germany to their labs to verify that it's honey. So NMR is very valuable too. Now they have labs in the United States. There's some American labs that have opened. And there was pushback over the last 3-4 years by a lot of the packers, but pretty much almost everyone is adopting it now. And it's become a good standard coupled with a couple of the other tests. So we're very happy with that. And, you know, customs, we can't say how customs is going to apply that, but they have told us, you know, they have no way, they don't have the budget to test 100% of the honey coming in, obviously, but they will use, you know, algorithms that come from different, you know, packers or from exporters that have had issues in the past, and do more sampling of those exporters that have issues, have had issues, and hopefully they will discover and keep some of this fake honey or adulterated honey from coming in.
That makes sense. So can you also tell people, one of the things I always get confused about, so how does someone know that honey is definitely from the US? Can you will it say on the front of the honey bottle? Is it going to say on the back, or how do we verify that it is from the US?
Yeah, it should, but a lot of the country of origin labeling, you have to hunt for it. Sometimes it's on the back, sometimes it's on the lid, sometimes it's on the bottle, just tiny inkjet. So if it's not prominent, a lot of the times it is blended. So make sure you look for USA only.
All right, thanks, Chris. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and hand it over to Mehdi now, who is going to moderate some of the questions that are coming in.
Thank you, everyone. That was a great discussion. We have a lot of questions. I will just start with Maria. What kind of research question are you investigating right now? And is this about honey or olive or other type of food frauds that you are researching?
Yeah, I have a few different threads kind of going. One thing I'm interested in is as we see increasing climate change, and so there's different sort of one thing I kind of forgot to talk about was how there's different types of products that are more open to adulteration, in that those that it's harder to tell if something has happened, but often targets are those very high-end products. And so working on Bordeaux wines, and how the Bordeaux region, there's some of those grape varieties are sort of being pushed to the limit, and as the temperatures change, will we see more, are they at greater risk than of fraud, especially in export markets in Asia? And then we're also looking at just this evaluation of emerging technologies to detect fraud, and which ones seem like the best economic investment if you're either at state and national levels. And then also, this is actually a little COVID-19 related, looking at how the interaction between the illegal food market and the illegal wildlife market.
Nice.
So there's lots to do, and actually students are very interested in this right now, so it's fun.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
And there is this question for everyone. There are a couple of them, and I will summarize. Is there inversion for the industry to establish their own credible quality certification scheme, which doesn't seem they have it so far? And do you think government should intervene and create one? If there is no certification is implemented, do you think the quality in the market would collapse? Any of you can start if you have.
Well, this is Dan. I just discussed the Olive Oil Commission of California. So that has been established for olive oil in California, and it's working very well.
I'm going to give the broad economist answer in that I think it depends on the product a little bit. Like if you are looking at a fine Bordeaux wine, there are, where it's a highly value-added product, it's probably in the best interest of the producers then to create their own certification process. But then if you're looking at, I think also sort of in a bigger picture though, if you're looking at things that have real public health risks, such as that interface of illegal wildlife and food trade, then there's definite, as we all now know, there's definite need for government monitoring and intervention. And I also think in places where there's like great food security risks and hunger, there's more of even international community responsibility.
Yeah, it's pretty rare to have an industry go seeking for regulation. But the honey, that's where we're at, because we've tried this self-regulation thing and the producers are being beat up. So I see that. I see the point of that question. A third party independent testing would be great. A lot of the packers in the United States use a lot of the German labs and some of the new American labs. But if there was one way to have a third party independent, that would definitely help. I see the point in that.
Yeah. And Chris, here is another question for you. Is there anything preventing domestic honey producers from printing 100% U.S. honey, as you mentioned, like Canadian ones, in their bottles?
Well, one issue is, we have a checkoff program. We have the National Honey Board, but as through Congress as part of it, it was established they cannot just promote USA honey only and cannot lobby, unfortunately. So they're promoting honey in general, and that's great. Consumption keeps going up, but a lot of that consumption is the cheap imports. That's one. Yeah, that was one thing that's happened over the years. We've tried to fight it and try to make it more of a, promote America honey only, but it just never did happen. I mean, that's sad, but it's just the state of it.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And Dan, here's a question from the audience: is that do you think it is a correct alternative to add a new category for best olive oils, not sensory effects, and that meets all the chemical requirements, such as premium or high-end quality olive oils?
So I really think that's an industry issue to discuss. And in California, they have discussed it. And the sense that I got from the producers in California was that they would prefer not to have a separate category for, say, a ultra premium or super premium oil. And one of the reasons for that is that the existing categories for olive oil grades are confusing enough to consumers. And so at least in California, the direction that they have gone is to try to elevate the quality of California olive oil. And we've been seeing gradual improvements year by year, particularly since the Olive Oil Commission was established.
Right.
And then just promote that California oil in general is a premium product compared to the rest of the oil that you would consume. But there definitely, in terms of the question, there's definitely some merit in separating out or segregating out the very highest quality olive oils, because even though they are all in the extra virgin category, there's a wide range of quality within that grade. And I don't know that that's unusual in how food grading works, but it may not be apparent to the consumer that it could still say extra virgin, but be sold for $5 and $35. And generally the $35 one will be higher quality, but not necessarily. Depends on how long it's been sitting on the shelf.
Right, yeah. Thank you, Dan. And Maria, there is a question for you. Could you please elaborate on the cost of food fraud figures? What type of cost goes into that figure and how it changed over time?
That's actually a good question. I actually think that the costs are higher. A lot of those costs are based on sort of the lost value of maybe retail product, just the retail value of the product, and the cost of enforcement and detection. They do not take into account like the cost to the consumer of eating consuming bad olive oil or having or syrup. And so there's actually greater work to be done by economists again on estimating the true social losses of that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this question that what type of consumers, income-wise, are more subject to the food fraud? Is there high-end, higher income consumers, or is there an issue of that the lower income consumers, they're more subject to the food fraud in general?
I'd say I actually don't know what the probability is across the board, but it's I think higher and lowest in terms of the food fraud that occurs of really basic economies that may be used in rice, flour, milk, especially in places where there isn't any regulation of things like powdered milk and baby formula.
Right.
So in a lot of developing countries, I think the risk is greater. And then it is also greater, I mean, at wine auctions and at the very high end. And then I think for the rest of us, it's more this indirect occurrence that happens through, that integration of processed oil into extra virgin oil, like we've been talking about, and syrups into honey, where there's some mixing that goes on, and we may not, it's further, or it happens further down the supply chain, where we have something being added as an ingredient into our final product, so we don't realize it.
Thank you. And this is the last question before I turn to Ellen to conclude. What are some of the policy recommendations? And this is for all three speakers. Really quick, what would be the one thing that you would recommend to the policymakers?
I'll just start off with, I mean, this is really, to this degree that this influences organized crime, promotes it, and promotes other types of illegal activities in this world. I think there's a social responsibility for all policymakers to be attentive to it and stop it, and provide in the US especially, just a tighter integration from local to national level of enforcement, as well as clearer communication across the different divisions of government, if not a special division of government to deal with it.
Thank you.
I would say that we need a national standard for olive oil because we don't have one now. And it doesn't make sense given that the US is the third largest consumer of olive oil in the world. So I think that's number one. It's certainly something that there's been a lot of discussion among the domestic and importer producers about this issue. And then I noticed that one of our attendees had indicated that maybe self-regulation is part of the problem here, and whether there should be an independent third party. And just to clarify, the Olive Oil Commission of California is under the state government of California. The California Department of Food and Agriculture runs that oversight. And so it actually is a state government entity. And I don't see any problem at all in having the industry collaborating with the state government in regulating the quality of domestic olive oil.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to follow up what Dan said, yeah, there are different states that have, like California does have a very good standard of identity, but it's just not enforced. Same with Florida. So, and that's the problem. I saw a question, how can, we have some of these importing companies have them pay 100% of the testing, or how can customs test more? Yeah, custom is just we're not the only food product, obviously, and they're not capable of testing everything coming in. That's why they're doing, hopefully do better at doing these targeted testing at more of the problem exporters. But one thing I would like to say is that, I don't know if Dan mentioned it when I dropped off, but Dr. Michael Roberts from the UCLA Food Fraud Center, he was very involved in the olive industry and representing even Paramount, wonderful, I think, to the Supreme Court against Coca-Cola and their pomegranate juice when Coca-Cola didn't have a pure 100% pomegranate juice product. And he, as recently, wrote some white papers for us for the honey industry. And even Walmart paid him to do the last paper that went before the United Nations Food and Agriculture. And honey was referenced many times in that paper. So there is recognition coming and being pointed out of food fraud and how bad it is. And these kind of seminars just help get the word out and let everybody know that there is a problem and it's hurting producers and our domestic industries having this food fraud over us. So
Thank you very
Well,
much.
I was just going to say it doesn't really just hurt the producers. This is just something from my New Zealand experience. It cycles down the supply chain. It hurts the agribusiness community and industry as well. And in the case of like New Zealand, an entire economy. And I said, yes, the Bordeaux producers need to maybe they would be more likely to protect their value added, but there does need to be recognition of the value added they bring, not just to themselves but to their economies. So there's a lot of regions and states that have higher needs for this.
Thank you very much, everyone. I turn it to Ellen to finish it up. Thanks again.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you again, Mariah, Chris, and Dan. And thanks to everyone attending today. Just want to save the date for February 9th from 10 to 11:30 a.m., which will be our next webinar. We're going to do another one on groundwater management in California, discussing water markets under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So please join us, visit our website for recordings and to subscribe to our mailing list. Thank you so much, everyone.